Get out of my store, Clara Whitmore. You've got nothing left to offer this town, and everybody here knows it." The words landed like a slap across her face, spoken loud enough for every soul in that general store to hear. Loud enough to follow her out the door and into the street where the cold wind off the Montana hills had no mercy either. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you desperately needed to be, then you already know what Clara felt in that moment. Stay with me until the end of this story and drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this has traveled. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Clara Whitmore had learned early that the world did not slow down for grief. It didn't slow down when her husband Thomas died 14 months ago. Thrown from a horse on a morning that started like any other morning. The sky pale and ordinary, no warning written anywhere in the light. It didn't slow down when the crops failed that summer, when the well ran shallow, when the north fence collapsed and she had no one to help her put it back up. It didn't slow down when the neighbors stopped coming around. One by one, the way people always find reasons to stop coming around when a woman's luck runs out, and they start to worry her misfortune might be catching. And it certainly did not slow down on that gray Thursday morning in October when Clara put on her cleanest dress, the dark blue wool one with the buttons she'd replaced twice, and walked the 2 miles into Red Willow with 22 cents in her coat pocket and a list of supplies she needed to survive the winter. She had rehearsed what she would say to Harold Fitch. She had rehearsed it the night before while she sat alone at the kitchen table by the one candle she let herself burn for an hour each evening, writing her words out on the back of an old letter because she knew she would lose her nerve if she didn't practice. She would be calm. She would be clear. She would remind him that Thomas had done business with the Fitch General Store for 9 years. That she had every intention of paying her debts once the spring brought better circumstances. That she only needed flour, salt, a small measure of dried beans, some lamp oil, and 2 spools of thread. She would ask politely. She would not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. The store was busy when she arrived. That was the first thing she registered how full it was. A Thursday morning crowd of women with their baskets and men picking up orders. The warm smell of coffee and sawdust and something baking somewhere in the back. She recognized almost every face. Margaret Holloway from the church committee. The Decker brothers from the hardware side of the building. Young Patrice Ames, who had been a year behind Clara in school and had married well last spring and wore it like a crown. They all saw her walk in. She felt their eyes the way you feel a draft, not from one direction, but from everywhere at once. A collective cooling that had nothing to do with the weather. Clara walked to the counter anyway. Harold Fitch was a broad man with a gray mustache and the practiced authority of someone who had never once in his life doubted that he deserved to be standing exactly where he was standing. He looked up from his ledger when she approached. His expression didn't change. That was almost the worst part of what came next, the fact that he wasn't surprised to see her, wasn't uncomfortable, wasn't even particularly unkind in the way his face settled. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already decided how to handle. "Clara," he said. "Good morning, Harold." She kept her voice even. She had practiced this part too. "I was hoping I might speak with you about extending my account for the season. I have a list here of what I need most urgently, and I can put down what I have today." "Your account's already extended," Harold said. "Extended twice over. I know that, and I'm not asking you to forget what's owed. I'm asking for a little more time." She set her list on the counter. Her hands were steady. She was proud of her hands right then. "Winter is coming on fast, and I have nothing put by. If you could just see your way to Clara." He said her name again. And this time it had a different weight to it. A closing the door kind of weight. "I'm running a business here, not a charity. You've got an outstanding balance of $41 and no visible means of settling it. I'm sorry for your situation, I am, but I can't keep carrying accounts that don't pay." She had expected this. She had prepared for this. What she had not prepared for was the silence that fell over the store. She became aware, all at once, of how still everything had gotten. No one was pretending to look at canned goods anymore. No one was murmuring to a companion or shuffling through a list. Every person in Harold Fitch's general store was watching Clara Whitmore stand at that counter with 22 cents in her pocket and a list of winter supplies she could not afford. And not one of them moved to say a word. "I understand," Clara said. Her voice was still even. She would hold on to that much. "I understand your position. But I've been a customer of this store for 9 years. Harold, my husband was your customer before that. All I'm asking," I said no. Louder this time. Not cruel. Harold Fitch wasn't a cruel man, which somehow made it worse, but final. Loud enough to reach the back of the room. "You've got nothing to put against that account, and everyone here knows it. I'm sorry, Clara, but I can't help you." She heard someone behind her shift their weight. She heard Patrice Ames murmur something to the woman beside her. Low and quick. She didn't turn around. She would not turn around. "All right," she said. She picked up her list from the counter, folded it once, twice, into a small rectangle, and tucked it back into her coat pocket. She looked Harold Fitch in the eye for one more second because she had her pride even now. Maybe especially now and then. She turned and walked back through the store and out the door. The cold air hit her face like a hand. She kept walking. Down the 2 steps, onto the boardwalk, and she was moving fast without realizing it. Her boots making too much noise against the planks. And she needed to get around the corner before she stopped at the corner of Fitch's store and the dry goods warehouse next door. Put her hand against the wooden wall. Breathed. She would not cry on Main Street. She would get home. She would figure something out. She would. That was a rotten thing he did in there. The voice came from behind her and slightly to the left. A man's voice. Low and even. Not the kind of voice that expected anything from her in response. Clara straightened, turned. He was leaning against the side of the warehouse, not lounging. Exactly. More like a man who had simply stopped moving and found the wall useful. Tall, dark-haired, the kind of dark that showed silver at the temples. A working man's coat, well-worn but kept. He had his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, which was the kind of thing a man did when he was thinking about something, or when he didn't know quite what to do with his hands. She had seen him before. Wyatt Mercer. He ran the Double M Ranch east of town, one of the larger operations in the area. He was not a man she knew well. Thomas had traded words with him a few times at the feed store, she thought, but she knew his name the way you knew the names of the people who occupied the edges of your life without ever quite stepping into the center of it. "I didn't ask for your opinion of it," Clara said. "No," Wyatt agreed. "You didn't." He didn't seem bothered by her tone. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, not pity, which she would have hated, and not the careful, nothing expression people used when they were trying not to get involved. Something more direct than either of those, like he was actually looking at her rather than at the situation she represented. "How far out is your place?" he asked. "That's not your business." "No," he said again, "it isn't." She started to walk. He fell into step beside her, at a distance that wasn't crowding far enough to the side that it was clearly optional. Clearly not presuming anything, which threw her, because she had been prepared to tell him to keep his distance. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I don't need company right now." "I know." "Then why are you walking?" "I'm heading to the feed store," he said. "It's the same direction." She glanced at him sidelong. His face was entirely serious. She couldn't tell if he was being honest or if that was the driest humor she had encountered in recent memory. And somehow the uncertainty of it was enough to loosen something slightly in her chest. They walked half a block in silence. "About 4 miles," she said. He didn't react to the non sequitur, just nodded once. Like she'd answered a question he'd asked recently, instead of one from 30 seconds ago. "That's a long walk in this cold," he said. I'm aware. Did you get what you needed in there? The question was so straightforward that it stopped her. Not because it was rude, it wasn't. It was just the kind of question no one had asked her in a long time. People asked how she was getting on, which meant they didn't really want to know. People asked if she was managing, which meant they hoped she'd say yes so they could stop worrying. Nobody had just asked, plainly, whether she had gotten what she needed. No, she said, I did not. Wyatt stopped walking. She stopped a pace later and turned back to look at him. What was on your list? He asked. Mr. Mercer, what was on your list? Mrs. Whitmore, his voice hadn't changed. It was still even. Still quiet, still carrying none of the pressure she expected. But he was looking at her with that same direct quality. That refusal to pretend this was a normal conversation about nothing. And she found herself answering before she'd decided to. Flour, salt, lamp oil, beans, thread. She paused. That was all, and medicine? Anything medical? She frowned. What? The Garner boy had a cough last week that went through half the East County ranches. I saw you'd been out that direction in August, visiting the Pattersons. I think someone mentioned. She stared at him. How do you know where I've been? Red Willow's a small town, he said. People talk. People certainly do. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, with the same calm delivery as everything else, Come with me, I beg your pardon? To the feed store. There's a supply depot attached on the south side, different owner from Fitch. No account with him. I'd just be purchasing directly. He put his hat back on. Adjusted the brim once, a small precise motion. I need to pick up a few things for my own place. You could tell me what you need, and I'll add it to my order. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Not gratitude. Not yet something more complicated than that. More defensive. I don't take charity. I know you don't, he said it simply. Without reassurance, without the softening people usually applied to that kind of response. This isn't charity. I'm offering to front the cost of supplies at a depot where no one's going to look at you like you walked in with mud on your shoes. You'd pay me back when you can. If you can't, we don't need to talk about it. That is the definition of charity. No, he said. That's the definition of neighbors. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze, without difficulty, without the nervous energy of someone who needed her to say yes so they could feel good about themselves. He was simply waiting, offering, taking no offense if she refused. That, more than anything, the lack of pressure in it, was what made her say the next thing she said. Why would you do that for someone you barely know? Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A slight change around the eyes, something she couldn't have named. Someone did it for me once, he said, when I had considerably less than nothing. Clara absorbed that. She looked down at the street for a moment, at the rut the wagon wheels had pressed into the mud, at the thin crust of frost on the edges of the boardwalk. One time, she said, and I'll repay every cent. I know you will, he said. As if this was already decided, as if he'd had no doubt about it from the beginning. They walked to the supply depot. Clara had been in Red Willow's feed store before. But not the Southside depot, it was smaller. Run by a man named Clement, who had a red beard and a mild disposition, and who greeted Wyatt with the familiarity of regular business and greeted Clara with no more or less attention than anyone warranted. She stood at his elbow while Wyatt gave the order, and when he paused and looked at her, she said, without meeting Clement's eyes, 20 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of salt, a quart of lamp oil, 2 pounds of dried beans. Thread, Wyatt said. I'll manage. 2 spools of thread, he told Clement. Black and white. Clara pressed her lips together and said nothing. When the supplies were loaded into Wyatt's wagon, he had a wagon, which she had not considered, and which now presented its own problem. He turned to her and said, as though he'd been thinking about it the whole time, My foreman's headed east this afternoon. Past your turnoff. He could take the supplies out. I can manage Mrs. Whitmore. He said her name quietly, without impatience, without any of the edge she kept waiting for. You walked 4 miles in the cold this morning to get something and came away empty. Let me have my foreman drive supplies to your property. That's all I'm saying." She looked at him across the wagon bed. "You don't even know me," she said. "I know enough," he said. She wanted to argue that. She wanted to tell him that no, he didn't, that knowing someone's name and the general direction of their property and the fact that they'd been turned away in a general store was not the same as knowing them. That help from strangers was rarely uncomplicated. That she had learned that the hard way more than once in 14 months of widowhood. But her back hurt from the walk and she was cold to the bone, and the thought of carrying that flour 4 miles on her own, which she had been fully prepared to do, felt suddenly and completely impossible in a way that she hadn't let herself admit until this moment. "Fine," she said. His foreman's name was Pete Dawson. A wire-thin man of 50-something, with a sun-battered face and the verbal economy of someone who had decided long ago that most things didn't need to be said out loud. He loaded the supplies without comment, drove her to the turnoff at her ranch road with no conversation beyond her directions, and helped her carry everything into the house with the efficient movement of a man who understood work. When he left, Clara stood in her kitchen with 20 pounds of flour and enough salt and oil and beans to get her through at least 6 weeks of careful rationing, and felt something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Not happiness, exactly, not relief, though that was part of it. Something quieter than either of those, the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having been seen accurately and helped without condition, and she didn't know what to do with it. She spent that evening putting everything in its place. She repaired the loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been bothering her for 3 weeks. She re-threaded her needle and mended the tear in her work skirt she'd been ignoring. She sat at the table long after the candle should have been out and looked at the kitchen. This kitchen she'd cooked in with Thomas. This kitchen she'd been fighting to keep warm alone for over a year. And she thought about the way Wyatt Mercer had said, "Without performance, I know enough." She thought about what that meant. What a man had to have seen in his own life to say something like that to a woman standing on a cold street after being publicly humiliated. To say it without pity or condescension or the particular smugness of someone who wanted to feel like a hero. She was still thinking about it when she finally went to sleep. 3 days passed before she saw him again. She was in the far north corner of her property, trying to assess the damage to the fence that had come down in the last windstorm, when she heard a horse on her property road. She straightened and shielded her eyes against the thin October sun. Wyatt Mercer rode alone. He came to the edge of her fence line, stopped his horse, and looked at what she was looking at. "That section's been down a while," he said. 2 weeks, she said. "I've been getting to it. Have you got wire?" She stopped. "Some. Enough to do the full run?" She looked at the fence. Looked back at him. No. He dismounted, tied his horse to a standing post, pulled on his work gloves. Clara stared at him. "What are you doing?" "I've got wire in my saddlebag and an hour before I need to be back," he said. "You want to stand there or you want to show me where it's worst? You can't just Mrs. Whitmore." He looked at her over the top of the fence. "Show me where it's worst." She showed him where it was worst. They worked for an hour and 20 minutes, side by side, almost without speaking. He worked the way she'd never seen a man of his standing work, not demonstrating anything, not performing effort, just working, steadily and well, the way someone worked who understood that the job was the thing and the rest of it was noise. When they finished the worst of it, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. "I was going to manage, I know." She was quiet for a moment. "You keep saying you know things about me that you can't possibly know." He pulled off his gloves, tucked them into his coat pocket, looked at the repaired fence. "You were Thomas Whitmore's wife for what, 6 years? 8. 8 years. And you stayed. That land there," he nodded toward the house, "you didn't walk away from it when half the county would have understood if you had. That tells me something." He looked at her directly. And you walked into Fitch's store and stood your ground in front of everyone and walked out with your head up. That tells me something else. Clara said nothing. There was something in her chest that she needed a moment to manage before she spoke. What does it tell you? She asked. That you're a woman worth standing beside, he said. Simply, without drama, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Not behind, not in front of, beside. She looked at him for a long moment. She was 41 years old and had been managing alone for over a year, and she had forgotten, or maybe she had never quite believed that a person could be seen that clearly by someone who had no particular obligation to look. I still owe you for the supplies, she said. I know, I'll find a way to Clara. It was the first time he'd used her first name. It stopped her. His voice was exact, as even as it always was. But something about the directness of it, the simplicity, made her go still. You don't have to keep accounting for yourself. Not to me, she swallowed. Looked away. Looked back. I don't know how to do that, she said. And it came out more honest than she had intended. More raw at the edges, the kind of confession she never meant to make and couldn't entirely regret once she had. I know, he said, and somehow this time she believed him. He left before dark. She watched him ride out and then stood alone in her field for a moment with the cold settling in and the repaired fence running straight and solid along the north line of her property. And something that had been pulled very tight inside her, something that had been pulled tight for 14 months, eased. Just slightly, just enough to notice, she went inside, made her fire, ate her supper, thought about the word beside. And she did not know yet what was coming, did not know that the next week would bring the thing she feared most. The knock at the door she had been dreading without knowing she was dreading it. The man from her husband's past who had kept himself quiet just long enough to let her believe she was safe. She did not know that the fight for everything she had built was about to begin. But she had begun, without quite realizing it, to understand that she would not have to fight it entirely alone. That was the thing about Wyatt Mercer. He didn't announce himself. He didn't make promises. He didn't offer her the kind of sweeping reassurance that sounded good and meant nothing. He just showed up, with wire in his saddlebag and gloves on his hands, and he worked beside her until the fence was standing again. And sometimes, in the terrible grinding work of survival, that was the only thing that mattered. The knock came on a Tuesday. Clara had been awake since before dawn. She was always awake before dawn now. Had been since the first winter alone, when she'd learned that the hours before sunrise were the hours when the mind ran loudest, and the only cure was to put your hands to work. She was at the kitchen table, mending a harness strap, when she heard it. 3 solid knocks on the front door, the kind that didn't apologize for themselves. She set down the strap, looked at the door. It was barely past 6 in the morning. Cold enough that her breath made small clouds in the kitchen air, and nobody with ordinary business came to a widow's door at 6 in the morning. She opened it anyway, because Clara Whitmore had stopped letting fear make her decisions for her sometime around month 3 of being alone. Wyatt Mercer stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and a look on his face she hadn't seen from him, yet not alarm exactly. But something adjacent to it, something careful and contained in the way he held himself. "There's talk in town," he said before she could speak. "Good morning to you too," she said. Something moved in his expression. Almost a smile, not quite. "Good morning. There's talk in town." She stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in." He came in, which surprised her a little. She'd half expected him to deliver whatever he had to say from the porch and leave, and stood in her kitchen with his hat still in his hands, looking at the harness strap she'd left on the table, at the single coffee cup she'd been nursing, at the kitchen that was hers and hers alone, and very clearly a place where no one else lived. "Sit down," she said, because her mother had raised her that way, regardless of the circumstances. He sat. She moved to the stove and poured a second cup without asking. "What kind of talk?" she said. "About you, about me being out here. He accepted the coffee. Didn't drink it immediately, just held it in both hands. Margaret Holloway told 3 people at the dry goods store yesterday that you've been receiving regular visits from a man with no husband in the house and that she found it concerning. Clara set her own cup down with slightly more force than she intended. She found it concerning. Those were her words. Margaret Holloway has been looking for something concerning about my life since Thomas died because it gives her something to organize herself around. Clara sat down across from him. What exactly did she say I was receiving visits for? Wyatt looked at her steadily. She implied that a woman in your financial situation might make certain arrangements to solve certain problems. The silence that followed that sentence was absolute. Clara felt the heat rise in her face, not embarrassment. Not quite. Something angrier and more precise than embarrassment. She looked at Wyatt across the table, and he held her gaze without flinching. Without the discomfort of a man who wishes he hadn't said the thing he just said. He'd said it because she needed to know it, and he'd said it plainly. And somehow that made it worse and better at the same time. How many people heard her? Clara asked. Enough. And what did you do when you heard it? I came here, he said. She studied him. Why? Because I thought you should know before you walked into town and heard it sideways from someone who thought you already knew. He set his coffee cup down. And because I wanted to ask you directly whether you wanted me to stop coming by. The question landed in the middle of the table between them and just sat there. Clara looked at it for a moment. Looked at him. Thought about the fence running straight and solid on her north line. Thought about Pete Dawson carrying flour into her kitchen without a word of comment. Thought about what it had cost her, in pride and in the particular exhaustion of relentless self-sufficiency, to get through the last 14 months. No, she said. He nodded once, picked up his coffee. Then we'll manage the talk, he said. How? By not giving it anything to feed on. He looked at her calmly. I'm not going to stop being your neighbor because Margaret Holloway has an overactive imagination. But if it helps, I can be less visible about it. Come by less regularly. Send Pete when there's work to do. Clara considered this. There was a part of her, the part that had been raised, to care about what the community thought. The part that understood how much a woman's reputation was her only currency in a town like Red Willow that recognized the practical wisdom in what he was saying. There was another part of her, a newer part, a part forged from 14 months of doing without and managing alone, that felt something hot and resistant at the idea of adjusting herself to fit Margaret Holloway's comfort. Let me think about it, she said. All right. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, rattling the loose board on the north side of the house she hadn't gotten to yet. That board's going to come off by the end of the week, Wyatt said. Without looking up from his coffee. I know, I've got nails. You've always got something, she said. This time the almost smile landed. It was a quiet thing. Barely there, just a slight shift at the corner of his mouth. But she caught it, and it did something unexpected to the tight wire of tension in her chest. Made it go slack for just a moment. I spent a lot of years without much of anything, he said. Tends to make a man keep his tools accounted for. She looked at him across the table. In all the times he'd been on her property, the fence, the supply run, the 2 brief conversations, since she realized she'd done very little actual wondering about him. She'd been too busy managing her own situation to spare much curiosity for his. What does that mean? She asked. A lot of years without much. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable. He didn't do uncomfortable in the way she was beginning to recognize, but thinking about how to say the thing accurately. I came to Montana with $40, a horse I wasn't sure would make the winter, and no particular prospects, he said. That was 12 years ago. Everything I have now, I built. But there was a stretch in the second year where I was close enough to nothing that a man named Caleb Rhodes, I barely knew him. He was a supplier for a ranch I'd worked one season. He fronted me enough to see me through a bad winter. Told me the same thing I told you. Pay me back when you can. He died before I had the chance. Clara was quiet. So I pay it forward, Wyatt said, when I can. To people who look like they're carrying something they shouldn't have to carry alone. That's a very deliberate philosophy for a man who presents himself as someone who just happened to be walking by, Clara said. This time the smile reached his eyes, just barely. I was actually going to the feed store. No, you weren't. He picked up his coffee. No, he said, I wasn't. The board on the north side rattled again. Louder. Wyatt glanced toward it the way a man glances at something he's already decided he's going to fix. I'll get that after I finish this, he said. You have a ranch to run, Clara said. You can't keep coming over here. My foreman runs the ranch, he said. I supervise, I make decisions, and I spend a remarkable amount of time on tasks that don't actually require me specifically. I have time. That is the least convincing thing you've said to me, Clara said. Then don't be convinced, he said. I'm still fixing the board. She wanted to argue. She could feel the argument forming, the one about self-sufficiency, and the value of managing without help, and the importance of not becoming dependent on something that might not last. It was a good argument. She'd been having it with herself for 2 weeks. But the board was rattling, and it was cold, and Wyatt Mercer was already setting down his coffee cup with the definitive air of someone who has finished a conversation by ending it. And Clara found she simply didn't have the energy to fight something that was also, quietly and against her will, something she didn't want to fight. There are nails in the shed, she said. Left side. Second shelf. He got up, put on his hat, and went to fix the board. She sat at her table and listened to the sound of hammering, regular and certain, and did not think about what it felt like to have a person in proximity who was simply there, without demanding anything of her in return. She absolutely did not think about that. She thought about it for the rest of the day. The rumors about Clara Whitmore and the man from the Double M spread through Red Willow the way rumors always spread through small towns, not quickly, not slowly, but with the thorough, pervasive quality of water finding its level, eventually reaching every surface. By the end of that week, she knew they had spread because of the way Patrice Ames looked at her outside the church on Sunday. That particular mixture of sympathy and satisfaction that meant someone had heard something they found more interesting than they were willing to admit. Clara looked back at her until Patrice looked away first. Small victories. She had decided, in the end, not to change anything. Not to become more invisible, not to make herself smaller to fit into the shape the town preferred for its widows. She had done nothing wrong. She would not behave as though she had. What she hadn't anticipated was how much that decision would cost her. The sewing circle met on Wednesday afternoons at the church hall, and Clara had been a member for 6 years. She had missed the last 3 meetings. The fall had been too demanding. The walk too long on days when she was exhausted, but she went this Wednesday. Partly because she needed the company, and partly, she admitted to herself, because she was tired of ceding ground. She arrived to find 7 women already seated, and she knew from the qualities, the silence that fell when she walked in, the sudden, too careful return to normal conversation, the way 2 or 3 women looked at their needlework with unusual intensity, that she had been the topic of discussion. She sat down, took out her mending, greeted the woman beside her, old Mrs. Crane, who was mostly deaf and therefore blissfully unaware of social temperatures. Mrs. Crane greeted her warmly and asked about her north fence. Getting it sorted, Clara said. Good girl, said Mrs. Crane and patted her knee. It was Margaret Holloway who broke the surface first. Of course it was. Margaret was a woman who believed that the greatest service she could render her community was to say the things that other people were only thinking, which was a comfortable belief for a person who enjoyed saying things. Clara, Margaret looked up from her embroidery with the practiced expression of someone performing concern. We've been wondering how you're getting on. Truly. The winter coming on as it is, and you out there alone. I'm not struggling, Clara said. Well, of course not. Although Margaret paused. The pause of someone who has been waiting for an opening. We have heard that you've been receiving some assistance. From Wyatt Mercer. He's my neighbor, Clara said. He's helped with some repairs. The way neighbors do. Of course. Of course. Margaret nodded, as though Clara had confirmed something rather than deflected it. It's only that people have been well talking. You understand. A woman alone, a single man coming and going, Margaret. Clara's voice was very quiet. The kind of quiet that caused the needlework in the room to slow. What, exactly, are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. Margaret's expression tightened at the edges. I'm simply expressing what the community, Clara said, watched Harold Fitch tell me in front of a room full of people that I had nothing to offer. I didn't hear the community say anything then. She looked around the circle, meeting eyes where they would meet hers. I don't particularly require the community's opinion about how I manage my property or who helps me maintain it. If that changes, I'll let you know. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Mrs. Crane, looking serenely around at everyone, said, Is there more coffee? I thought I smelled coffee. Someone got up to get the coffee. The conversation moved, with the slightly unnatural ease of water, going around an obstacle, to other topics. But Clara felt it, the shift in the room, the way the air had changed between her and certain women. The particular temperature of people who had expected someone to back down and were recalculating in the wake of her not doing so. She didn't regret it. She did, walking home that afternoon in the thin gray light, feel the full weight of what it cost to stand your ground in a small town. The cost wasn't dramatic. It wasn't one moment or one confrontation. It was the slow accumulation of small exclusions, the conversations that stopped, the invitations that didn't come, the way people who had once nodded warmly in the street suddenly found reasons to look the other way. She had been here before, in the first months after Thomas died, when people didn't know what to say to her and chose to say nothing. She had learned to live inside that particular cold. She could live inside it again. What she hadn't expected was for Wyatt to find out what had happened. He came by 2 days later, a Friday, mid-morning, and she knew from the way he got off his horse that something had shifted in him. Not anger. He didn't carry anger the way most men did. Out front and loud. He carried it the way he carried everything. Inward, contained, visible only if you knew where to look. She was beginning to know where to look. You went to the sewing circle, he said. I'm a member, she said. I know. He came to where she was standing at the porch rail. I heard what you said to Margaret Holloway. The town talks fast. The town talks constantly, he said. Clara, don't. She looked at him. Don't tell me I shouldn't have said it. Don't tell me I should have been more careful or more diplomatic or more I wasn't going to, he said. She stopped, looked at him. I was going to say I'm sorry, he said. That my being here has made things harder for you. I didn't think it through well enough at the start. Something in her chest did a complicated thing. You didn't make anything harder, she said. Margaret Holloway made things harder. The people who whisper made things harder. She shook her head. You fixed my fence. And caused a scandal, apparently. Only a small one, she said. By Red Willow standards, this barely registers. He looked at her. You're not as bothered by this as you should be. I'm bothered, she said. I'm just not willing to let it move me. She paused. Are you? He looked at her for a long moment. Something in the quality of his attention shifted. Became more concentrated, more focused. No, he said. I'm not. They stood on the porch for a moment in the cold. Not speaking, in the particular silence of two people who have just established something without using the words for it. I brought lumber, Wyatt said finally, for the porch step. The left one's going to give way. I noticed that, she said. It's on the list. I have a very long list, I know, he said. And went to get the lumber. What followed was the most ordinary and, Clara would think later, most significant 2 weeks of that entire winter. Wyatt came by when he had time 3 or 4 mornings a week. Sometimes just for an hour, sometimes longer. He never arrived empty-handed, and he never arrived with fanfare. Lumber, wire, a box of candles, a spare hinge for the barn door. A jar of liniment for her hands, left on the porch step, without comment on a day she'd come in, with her knuckles cracked and bleeding from the cold. He fixed the porch step. He reinforced the barn door. He looked at the kitchen chimney, which had been drawing badly, and spent half a morning clearing a blockage she hadn't been able to locate. He brought his own tools and put them away when he was done. And he worked in the clean, efficient way of someone who understood that help was most useful when it didn't make the person being helped feel managed. In between they talked. Not long conversations mostly. Not the kind with a shape to them, a beginning and a purpose and a tidy end. More like the talking that happens between people who are working alongside each other and don't feel the need to be quiet just for the sake of appearances. She told him about Thomas, not the grief of it, not yet, but the practical reality, the kind of man he'd been, the things he'd built, the particular way he'd approached a problem. Wyatt listened the way good listeners did, without filling the pauses. He told her about the 12 years since he'd arrived in Montana with $40 and a failing horse. About the first ranch he'd worked, a brutal operation in the North Country where the foreman ran the men the way a man ran cattle, with noise and force and no particular concern for what fell. About Caleb Rhodes, who had fronted him through that bad winter and died of influenza following spring without ever knowing what it had meant. About building the double acre by acre, year by year, the way you built anything worth having, not all at once. Not by luck, but through the accumulated weight of small decisions consistently made. "Do you ever get lonely?" Clara asked him, on a morning when they were working in the barn and the question came out before she'd decided to ask it. He was quiet for long enough that she thought maybe she'd overstepped. "Yes," he said. Most of the time, she looked at him across the barn. "That surprises you," he said. "A little," she admitted. "You seem like someone who prefers his own company. Preferring something and being satisfied by it aren't the same thing," he said. He looked back at what he was working on. "I'm comfortable alone. That's not the same as not wanting anything different." She thought about that for the rest of the morning. The trouble started on a Thursday, the way trouble often started quietly. At first, arriving in a form too small to take seriously until it was already too large to ignore. She was in town to drop off eggs at the dry goods store, one of the small trades she'd established to manage her account with a different merchant than Fitch, when she overheard two men talking outside the hardware store. She recognized one of them, Vernon Hale, who ran the small law office at the end of Main Street. The other was a stranger, a man in a coat that was too good for the weather and too deliberate for the town. The kind of coat that was meant to tell you something before its owner said a word. She wouldn't have paid it any attention except that she heard her name. Whitmore Property. The widow. She stopped, adjusted the basket on her arm, looked at the dry goods window as though she was reading the notices posted there. Old agreement before he died. Pruitt's got documentation. What kind of documentation? Business debt. Land put up as collateral. Apparently, Whitmore signed something he shouldn't have signed, and the family's just been sitting on it waiting to see if the widow would walk away on her own. A pause. The sound of a boot shifting on the boardwalk. "She hasn't walked away," said Vernon Hale. "No," said the stranger. "Which is why Pruitt's coming himself." Clara kept her eyes on the window. She was aware of her own heartbeat with unusual clarity. She was aware of the basket in her hands, and the cold air, and the particular sound of those words landing in her. Pruitt's coming himself. She didn't know the name. She didn't know the documentation. She didn't know what her husband had signed, or what he hadn't told her, or why Thomas had been a private man about certain things. The financial things especially, with the particular pride of a man who didn't want his wife to see when he was struggling. But she knew what the words "land put up as collateral" meant. She turned from the window, walked to the dry goods store. conducted her trade with her hands perfectly steady and her voice perfectly even, and her mind running at a speed she hadn't asked it to and could not slow down. She walked home, all 4 miles, fast. She went to Thomas's desk, the one in the small room he'd used as an office, the room she hadn't touched much since he died, because going in, there was still the kind of thing that required preparation. She pulled open the bottom drawer, the one with the locked box, and found the key on the chain she'd been keeping in her apron pocket for 14 months without exactly knowing why she'd kept it. She opened the box. Land documents. Their marriage record. Thomas's discharge papers from a long ago military service she hadn't known much about. Letters. And at the bottom, folded twice, a piece of paper with the creases of something that had been put away quickly and not touched since. She unfolded it. She read it once, then again. Then she sat down on the floor of that small room with the paper in her hands and understood, for the first time, the shape of the thing that was coming for her. Thomas had borrowed money 3 years before he died, before the bad seasons. Before the horse, before any of it had gone wrong, he had borrowed a substantial sum from a man named Gerald Pruitt, who ran a land acquisition operation out of Billings. He had put up 50 acres of the North Field as collateral. He had told no one. He had apparently intended to pay it back before it mattered. He had not paid it back. She didn't know, sitting on that floor, whether to be furious with him or to understand him completely. And both feelings arrived at the same time, which was its own particular kind of loss. She loved Thomas. She had loved him imperfectly, the way you loved someone you built a life with full knowledge of their weaknesses, and without pretending those weaknesses didn't exist. This was one of his weaknesses. Pride. The inability to say, "I'm in trouble," to the one person who would have helped him. She folded the paper, put it back in the box, locked it. She sat for another minute on the floor of her dead husband's office. In the house she had been fighting to keep warm through an entire winter alone. And she thought about a man in a coat, too good for the weather, saying, "Pruitt's coming himself." Then she got up off the floor. She went to the kitchen, put on her coat, walked out the door and down the road, and kept walking, in the cold, for 45 minutes until she reached the Double M's fence line. She had never come to him before. She recognized with one part of her mind that this was a significant thing, that walking to his property, to his door, meant something she hadn't let herself mean before. She knocked anyway. A ranch hand answered and went to find Wyatt, who came to the door in his work clothes with the look of a man who had been doing something physical and had stopped mid-task. He looked at her face, and the look he had contained. Careful look shifted immediately into something sharper. "What happened?" he said. She told him. Standing in the doorway, quickly, without softening it or building to it, she just said the thing. The whole of it, the overheard conversation, and the locked box, and the paper with Thomas's signature on it. When she finished, Wyatt was quiet for 3 seconds. "Come in," he said. "I don't need Clara." His voice was very level. "Come in and let me think." She came in. He had a desk in his front room, a working desk covered in the organized papers of a man who ran a serious operation. He sat at it. She sat across from him. He asked her 3 questions. The amount of the debt, the date on the paper, and whether Thomas had made any payments she was aware of. She answered all 3. He was quiet again, looking at the desk surface without seeing it, which she was learning meant he was actually looking at the problem from the inside. "There are 2 issues," he said finally. "Whether the document is valid, and whether Pruitt can act on it even if it is." He looked at her. "Has he been to the house yet?" "No, the men I overheard. I don't think he's in town yet." "Coming," they said. "Then we have a little time." He looked back at his desk. "Vernon Hale, he was one of the men you overheard?" "Yes." "Hale's not Pruitt's man. He's just the local lawyer who handles land transfers. He'd be involved because he knows the local documents." Wyatt was thinking out loud now, and she let him. "The question is whether Pruitt's documentation is clean." 3 years is a long time. A lot can happen to a document in 3 years. What are you saying? I'm saying that a man who makes his living acquiring land from people who can't pay their debts doesn't always have clean paperwork. He looked at her directly. I'm saying there's a fight here, if you want to have it. Clara looked at him across the desk. That's my home, she said. I know. That's 50 acres of the North Field that I have been working alone for 14 months. I know. Then I want to have the fight, she said. She stopped, looked down at her hands on her knees. I don't know how. We'll figure out the how, Wyatt said. And there was something in the word we that she didn't argue with. Not this time, not sitting in his office with the cold coming in and a document she didn't know existed threatening to take everything she had left. Not this time. All right, she said. He nodded once. Then let's start, he said. And outside, somewhere between Red Willow and the Double M, a man in a coat too good for the weather was already on his way. Gerald Pruitt arrived on a Monday. Clara knew it before she saw him. The way you sometimes know a thing is coming, not because of any particular signal, but because the air around you changes the way animals go quiet before a storm. The way a room shifts its temperature without anyone opening a door. She had been expecting him for 5 days, and those 5 days had been the kind of waiting that hollows you out from the inside. That makes ordinary tasks feel like performance. That turns every sound on the road into something you have to consciously talk yourself out of. She was in the barn when Pete Dawson rode up from the direction of town. He didn't usually come without Wyatt, which told her something before he opened his mouth. Man came into town this morning, asking directions to the Whitmore property, Pete said. Big fellow, city coat. Came with a younger man carrying a leather satchel. Clara set down the brush she'd been using on the mare. Did you hear his name? Didn't need to, Pete said. Wyatt told me what to watch for. That's him. She nodded once. All right. Wyatt's coming. He said to tell you he'll be here within the hour. Tell him I know, she said. Tell him I'll be ready. Pete looked at her the way people were starting to look at her recently, with a kind of quiet reassessment. As if something they'd assumed about her had turned out to be wrong. He nodded and rode back the way he'd come. Clara went inside, washed her hands, changed her shirt, and put on the dark blue wool dress with the replaced buttons. She was not going to meet Gerald Pruitt in her barn clothes. She was going to meet him as the owner of this property, standing in her own house, and she was going to be absolutely clear in her bearing about which of them had the right to be there. She had spent the last 5 days in preparation that would have surprised the people who assumed a widow alone had no resources. Wyatt had driven her to Billings 2 days after she'd told him about the document, a long, cold, largely silent trip made significant by the fact that he'd arranged it within 12 hours of her walking to his door. They had met with a lawyer named Arthur Finch, who was not a warm man but was a thorough one, and who had looked at Thomas's document with the careful blankness of a professional concealing his thoughts. This is dated 3 years, and 4 months ago, Finch had said. Yes, Clara said. And your husband passed 14 months ago. Yes. Finch had looked at the document for another moment. Then he'd looked at Wyatt, then more deliberately. Back at Clara. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, did your husband make any payments on this debt? Any at all, partial, irregular, anything you're aware of? I didn't know about the debt until 5 days ago, Clara said. But I've gone through every financial record my husband kept. There's no evidence of payments made to anyone named Pruitt. And has Pruitt or his representative made any contact with you? Any letters? Any formal notice? Nothing. Finch had set the document down and folded his hands. Then here is what I can tell you. The document appears genuine on its face. The terms are aggressive but not unusual for the type of lender Pruitt is. However, and here he'd paused, in the deliberate way of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say, there are statutes in Montana Territory governing the notification requirements for debt collection against an estate. When Mr. Whitmore died, this debt became a claim against his estate. Pruitt was legally required to file that claim within a specific window. Clara had gone very still. And did he? Not in Fitch County, Finch said. I checked before you arrived. There is no record of any claim filed by Gerald Pruitt or his affiliated companies against the estate of Thomas Whitmore in this jurisdiction. Across the desk, she had heard Wyatt exhale slowly. What does that mean for the land? Clara asked. It means, Finch said, that if Pruitt attempts to enforce this document now, he has a procedural problem, possibly an insurmountable one. He looked at her carefully. It does not mean he won't try. Men like Pruitt count on the people they approach not knowing their rights. They count on a widow alone being too frightened or too uninformed to push back. He paused. He didn't count on you arriving in my office. She had looked at Arthur Finch across his desk and felt something shift in her chest, not triumph yet. It was too early for that, and she'd learned the hard way not to count victories before they were finished, but something clarifying. The particular feeling of a problem taking its proper shape. What do we do? She asked. Finch had told her. So, she knew what she was standing in when Pruitt's wagon came up her road that Monday morning. She knew the ground she was standing on, and she knew her rights on it. And she had spent 5 days making sure she was ready to use both. Wyatt arrived 12 minutes before Pruitt did, which she suspected was not accidental. He came to the door already with his hat off, which meant he'd been riding fast and was making himself appear unhurried. Finch sent the letter? Clara asked. Sent it Friday. Pruitt should have received it Saturday morning at the latest. He looked at her. He's coming anyway. Of course he is, she said. Men like him don't change course because of a letter. They come to look you in the eye and decide whether you're serious. Wyatt looked at her for a moment. With that particular quality of attention, she'd become familiar with the complete, undivided kind that didn't perform itself. Are you ready? He asked. I've been ready since Thursday, she said. Gerald Pruitt was exactly what she'd expected and slightly worse. He was a big man, not fat but constructed with a kind of deliberate solidity. The build of someone who had decided early in life that taking up space was a form of argument. He wore a coat that cost more than Clara's monthly food expenses and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his professional life been turned away at a door. The younger man with the satchel was named Cowboy. He had careful eyes and said nothing unless spoken to, which suggested he was either very junior or very experienced. Clara suspected the latter. Pruitt came to her door, which she answered without hurrying. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Gerald Pruitt. I believe you've been expecting me. I received a letter from your office, she said, and a separate letter from Arthur Finch in Billings on the matter of the document you hold. Please come in. She said please with the particular inflection of a woman who is extending courtesy because she chooses to, not because she is required to. Pruitt noticed. She saw him notice. He came inside. He saw Wyatt standing near the desk, and his expression made a small, controlled adjustment. Mr. Mercer, he said. I didn't expect you here, Mrs. Whitmore is my neighbor, Wyatt said. His voice was entirely pleasant. I had some business to discuss with her this morning. There was a pause in which all three of them understood that this was a specific kind of untruth and that no one was going to address it directly. Well, Pruitt settled into the chair Clara had indicated. She'd positioned the chairs deliberately, the way Finch had suggested, so that she sat behind the desk and he sat across from it, which changed the geometry of the conversation before a word was spoken. He looked around the room. This is a fine property, Mrs. Whitmore. I can see why you're attached to it. It's my home, Clara said. Let's not be decorative about this, Mr. Pruitt. You have a document you believe gives you a claim to 50 acres of the North Field. I have a letter from my attorney explaining why that claim is not legally enforceable. You've come here to determine whether I'll fight you or whether you can frighten me into settling. I'd like to save us both some time. The silence that followed, that was the kind that changed the temperature of a room. Pruitt looked at her. For the first time since he'd walked in, his expression held something other than managed authority. Something that might, on a less controlled face, have been surprise. "You've done your research," he said. "I've done my homework," Clara said. "There's a difference. Research implies something academic. This is my home, Mr. Pruitt. I tend to take the defense of my home seriously." Pruitt placed his hands flat on his knees. Looked at Cowell briefly, the way a man checks with his subordinate when he needs a half-second to recalculate. Then back at Clara. "Your attorney's letter raises a procedural point," he said. "I want to be clear that I have my own legal counsel's opinion on that point, and it differs substantially from Mr. Finch's interpretation." "I'd expect nothing less," Clara said. "The document your husband signed is a valid contract. The debt is real. The collateral was subject to estate claim procedures that your office failed to follow," Clara said. "Within the statutory period. I have the county records." She opened the desk drawer and placed a folder on the desk. "This is a copy of the estate filing record from Fitch County. Your claim does not appear in it. The statutory window closed 8 months ago." Pruitt looked at the folder. Did not touch it. "Legal interpretation is rarely as clean as either party prefers," he said. "No," Clara agreed, "which is why I've retained Mr. Finch to make the argument before Judge Harlan in Billings, if that becomes necessary." She folded her hands. "Is that what you'd like, Mr. Pruitt? Because I want to be clear that I am prepared for exactly that." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Wyatt, then back at her. "You understand," he said, "that litigation is expensive. A widow managing a homestead, the costs alone could exceed what you'd lose by. Are you advising me about my finances?" Clara's voice had gone very quiet. "You came to my home to threaten me with costs, with the expense of defending what's already mine." "I'm not threatening anyone," Pruitt said. And his voice had a new edge now, faint but present, the edge of a man who had expected a different conversations than the one he was having. "I'm making you aware of practical realities." "The practical reality," Clara said, "is that you didn't file your claim on time, and now you're here hoping I won't notice." She looked at him steadily. "I noticed, Mr. Pruitt." Another silence. This one had a different quality, not the silence of a room recalibrating, but the silence of a man deciding something. Pruitt stood up. He was still big, still solid, still took up more space than ordinary people. But something about him was different from when he'd walked in. Some quality of assumption had shifted, and Clara could feel it the way you feel a change in wind direction. "I'll be in Red Willow through Wednesday," he said, "in case you reconsider the conversation." "The conversation is complete," Clara said. "Unless you'd like to discuss the return of any documentation my husband signed, which belongs to this estate." Pruitt looked at her one more time. The look lasted long enough that Wyatt moved, just slightly. A small shift of weight that was enough to be noticed. "Good day, Mrs. Whitmore," Pruitt said. "Good day, Mr. Pruitt." She walked both men to the door, closed it behind them, stood with her hand on the door handle for approximately 3 seconds before she turned around and let out the breath she had been managing for the last 40 minutes. Wyatt was watching her. "That was," he started. "Don't," she said. "Clara, if you tell me that was impressive, I will need you to leave," she said. "I'm still shaking, and I don't want to be impressive right now. I just want to be a person who's shaking." He was quiet for a moment. "Then all right." She sat down in the chair behind the desk, put both hands flat on the wood, looked at the folder of county records she'd spent 3 nights compiling. "He's not done," she said. "No," Wyatt agreed. "That was him deciding whether I was real or performing. He's going to go back and talk to his lawyers, and they're going to tell him the procedural problem is real, and then he's going to make another move." "What kind of move?" She looked up. "I don't know yet. That's what worries me." Wyatt pulled the other chair around to her side of the desk and sat down beside her. "Beside," she noted. "Not across." He looked at the folder. "Walk me through what you have," he said. She walked him through it. Every document, every record, every date. He listened the way he did everything completely, without interrupting, asking 2 questions at the end that were precise enough to tell her he'd understood all of it. The weak point, he said, is the date on your husband's signature. Finch is right that the procedural argument is strong. But if Pruitt's lawyers can argue that the clock on the estate claim didn't start when Thomas died, if they can argue there was some legal reason the window was told, then the procedural defense weakens, Clara said. Yes, I know. She looked at the folder. I've been thinking about that. There's something else, though. Something I haven't told Finch yet, because I wasn't sure what to make of it. Wyatt looked at her. The amount on that document, she said. $430. Thomas borrowed $430 from Pruitt 3 years ago. She paused. But I went through every record we have, every account, every purchase, every transaction from that year. I can't find where $430 went. There's no improvement to the property, no equipment purchase, no livestock that wasn't already accounted for, no debt paid off. She looked at Wyatt. Where did that money go? He was very still. You think the document might not be what it claims, he said. I think the document is real, she said carefully. Thomas's signature is real. I know his hand well enough to be certain of that. But I'm wondering whether the terms he thought he was signing and the terms on that document are the same terms. The silence between them had a new quality now. Sharper, more focused. You think Pruitt altered it, Wyatt said. I think it's possible, she said. I think a man who makes his living doing this to people acquiring land from people who can't pay might find it useful to have a document that says one thing when the person who signed it thought it said another. Yes, she said. It is. He leaned back in the chair, looked at the ceiling briefly. Looked back at her. If you're right, he said, it changes everything. It's not just a procedural defense. It's a criminal matter. If I'm right, she said, which I might not be. I'm working from a dead man's financial records and an absence of evidence, which is not the same as evidence. But it's enough to dig on. It's enough to dig. They looked at each other across the few inches of space between their chairs in the kitchen of the house she was fighting to keep, with the county records spread out between them and a man in an expensive coat currently somewhere in Red Willow recalculating his approach. I need to talk to people who knew Thomas's business, she said. People he might have talked to when he was raising that money. He wouldn't have gone to Pruitt first. Men like Thomas go to Pruitt last. When every other door has closed. Someone in this county knew he was trying to borrow money 3 years ago. I know who he would have asked first, Wyatt said. She looked at him. Cal Dennison, the grain merchant. Thomas did business with him every season, and Dennison does small loans on the side. It's not widely known, but people in the farming community know it. He was already thinking ahead. She could see it. If Thomas tried to borrow through Dennison, and Dennison turned him down, Dennison would remember it. Would he talk to me? Wyatt looked at her. He'll talk to me. I buy a significant amount of grain. She absorbed that. The way he said it, without apology, without pretending that his position wasn't useful, without making her feel managed about the usefulness of it. All right, she said. The conversation with Cal Dennison happened the next morning, and it cracked the case wide open in a way that neither of them had entirely expected. Dennison was a small man who moved with the nervous energy of someone for whom transactions were a physical experience. Hands always moving, weight always shifting. He received Wyatt with the warmth of a man maintaining an important business relationship, and Clara with the careful courtesy of someone who had heard the stories but wasn't sure what to make of the real person. When Wyatt explained what they were looking for, without naming Pruitt directly, just asking whether Tom Whitmore had approached him about a loan 3 years back, Dennison's hands went still. That was the tell, the absolute stillness of the hands. Why are you asking about that, he said. Because it matters, Wyatt said. And because Mrs. Whitmore has a right to know what her husband was trying to do. Dennison looked at Clara. Something in his expression shifted. Guilt, she thought. The specific guilt of a man who knows something he's been sitting on. I turned him down, he said. Tom came to me 3 years ago, wanting to borrow $500. He said he had an opportunity, a chance to expand the North Field, bring in better equipment. I didn't have the capital to front that much at the time. I told him I was sorry. He paused. He said he'd find another way. $500, Clara said. Yes, not 430. Dennison frowned. No, 500. That was the amount he needed. Clara looked at Wyatt. He was looking at her with the stillness of a man who has just heard the thing that changes the shape of a problem. The document in Thomas's locked box said $430. Thomas Whitmore had told Cal Dennison he needed $500. A man borrowing money to fill a specific need does not borrow less than he needs. He borrows the amount he needs, or more, not $70 less. Unless the document had been altered, unless the original had said $500, the amount Thomas had actually needed, and someone had changed it later. Changed the amount, changed the terms, made a legitimate debt into something that served a different purpose entirely. She kept her face still. She kept her voice even. She thanked Cal Dennison and walked out of his store with Wyatt beside her and waited until they were half a block down the street before she spoke. He changed the amount, she said. It looks that way, Wyatt said. Pruitt took a real debt and altered the document. He changed the amount and probably the terms, which means the document he's been holding for 3 years isn't the one Thomas signed, which makes it fraud, Wyatt said. Real, provable fraud, not a procedural argument, not a technicality. A crime. Her heart was beating very fast. She kept walking, kept her pace steady, because she was on Main Street, and she was not going to let anyone see her hands shake twice in 2 days. We need to get this to Finch, she said.
I'll send a wire
this afternoon, Wyatt said. We need to see if there are other people in this county or neighboring counties who Pruitt has done this to. If he altered Thomas's document, he's done it before. Men don't invent a method once. And if he's done it before, then there's a pattern. And a pattern is a case. They stopped at the corner of Main and 2nd, where their paths divided. Clara looked at Wyatt. He was watching her with that complete, direct attention of his, taking the full measure of her, and she looked back at him and felt very clearly, for the first time, the difference between surviving and fighting. She had been surviving for 14 months. She had been in a defensive crouch, managing what was in front of her, enduring one thing at a time. This was something else. This was standing upright. This was taking the threat and turning it around, and looking for its weak seams and finding them, and pulling. I have to go back through all of Thomas's records, she said. Everything. I need to find anything else I might have missed. I'll come by tonight, Wyatt said. Second set of eyes, she looked at him. You don't have to, Clara. He said her name the way he'd started saying it, not gently exactly, but with a particular steadiness, like an anchor. Stop telling me what I don't have to do. She stopped. Looked at him. I know, she said quietly. I know you don't have to. That's not. She paused. I'm not used to someone choosing to. He held her gaze for a moment that was 1 second longer than necessary. Get used to it, he said. She went home. She was at Thomas's desk an hour later when she found the second thing. Not in the locked box, which she'd already combed through twice, but in the bottom of the filing drawer, under a stack of planting records she'd assumed were routine. A letter, handwritten on paper with a Billings letterhead she didn't recognize, dated 2 months before Thomas died. She read it 3 times. It was from a man named Harlan Cross, who appeared to be a business associate of Gerald Pruitt's. It referenced the loan, and it referenced an offer, a formal, documented offer to purchase the North Field outright, for a sum that was strikingly low, from a third party she'd never heard of. Thomas had written one word in the margin of that letter. In his careful hand. No, she sat with that letter in her hands for a long time. long enough that the light shifted and the room got colder and she had to get up and put more wood on the fire. Thomas had known. He'd known what Pruitt was doing, or he'd sensed it. Sensed the shape of it, the way a man sensed when a business proposition had teeth pointing the wrong direction. He'd turned down the offer. And then he'd died, and the offer had sat in Pruitt's back pocket for 14 months, while Pruitt watched to see if the widow would fold on her own. She hadn't folded. So Pruitt had come. She set the letter on the desk, smoothed it flat, put it next to the county records folder and the copy of the original document and the notes she'd made from the conversation with Arthur Finch. Her case was building, not just a procedural argument, not just a question of dates and windows, something with substance, evidence of intent, evidence of a pattern, evidence that what Gerald Pruitt had been doing to her family was not a simple debt collection, but a deliberate, premeditated scheme. She was still sitting there when Wyatt knocked on the door at 7 o'clock. Arriving as he said he would, bringing no announcement and no fanfare, just a second set of eyes and the particular quality of presence that she had stopped trying to be unaffected by. She showed him the letter. He read it once. Then he set it down on the desk very carefully. The way you set down something that matters. He made an offer to buy the land while Thomas was still alive, Wyatt said. 2 months before he died. And Thomas turned it down. Thomas wrote no in the margin, Clara said. One word. He didn't even tell me about it. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He was trying to handle it himself. Yes. She looked at the letter. He was always trying to handle things himself. Something in her voice must have carried more than she intended. Because Wyatt looked at her differently, not with pity, but with something she hadn't allowed herself to need, and found herself needing anyway. Recognition. The simple acknowledgement that this was hard, that loving a person who couldn't ask for help was its own particular grief, layered inside the grief of losing them. He loved you, Wyatt said. Men like that, the ones who won't say they're struggling, they're usually trying to protect someone. I know, she said. It doesn't make it less lonely. The word landed between them with a weight that surprised her. She hadn't meant to say it. She hadn't known she was going to say it until it was already out. Wyatt didn't look away. No, he said quietly. It doesn't. She looked at the letter on the desk. She looked at the folder of evidence she'd built over 5 days of careful, deliberate work. She thought about Pruitt in his good coat and his assumption that a widow alone was a problem that solved itself. She thought about the word no that Thomas had written in the margin. And she felt something clarify in her, not anger, not grief, not even determination exactly, but something that contained all three of those things, and was larger than any one of them. A kind of commitment to herself, to the land, to the 8 years she and Thomas had built something real on it, and the 14 months she'd kept building it alone. He tried, she said. He wrote no, and he tried to figure it out, and then he ran out of time. She looked at Wyatt. I'm not going to run out of time. No, Wyatt said. You're not. He pulled his chair closer to the desk. Let's build this, he said. And outside in Red Willow, Gerald Pruitt was still in his hotel room, and he didn't know yet what was coming for him. And that was the most important advantage they had. Arthur Finch arrived in Red Willow on a Thursday morning, and he brought company. Clara had not expected that. She'd expected the man himself, with his careful face and his thorough mind. But Finch stepped off the stage with a woman beside him, small, older, dressed in the precise way of someone who understood that appearance was argument, and a young man carrying 2 leather cases that appeared to weigh considerably more than he was comfortable with. Wyatt met them at the stage stop. Clara stood beside him and watched Finch cross the street with the unhurried stride of a man who had already decided how the next 48 hours were going to go. Mrs. Whitmore, Finch said. This is Eleanor Vass. She's a document examiner out of Billings, best in the territory, possibly in the region. He paused. When you told me your theory about the altered document, I took the liberty of asking her to come. Clara looked at Eleanor Vass. The woman had sharp gray eyes, and the kind of stillness that suggested she had spent decades looking at things very closely and had learned that patience was a professional skill. "You believe the document was altered," Eleanor said. "It wasn't a question. I believe the amount was changed," Clara said. "And possibly the terms. Do you have the original?" "I have what Pruitt claims is the original. I have no way of knowing if it matches what my husband signed." Eleanor nodded once. "Then let's find out," she said. They went to Clara's house. Eleanor Vass set up at the kitchen table, with tools Clara had never seen before: a magnifying glass of unusual size, a series of small glass vials, paper she apparently carried herself, and she worked for 2 hours, in a silence that had the focused quality of surgery. Clara sat across the room with her hands folded and did not speak, because she understood from 5 minutes of watching Eleanor Vass that interruption was not something the woman tolerated. Wyatt stood near the window. Finch sat at the desk and organized his papers. At the end of the 2 hours, Eleanor set down her magnifying glass and looked up. "The amount was changed," she said. "The original entry was $500. The figure was altered carefully, professionally, but altered. There is also a change to the collateral clause. The original language appears to have specified a lien, not an outright claim. What's on this document now is not what was signed." The kitchen went very quiet. Clara felt it move through her, not surprised or climbed, because she had believed this for days. But the particular impact of having a belief confirmed, of having the thing you suspected turn out to be real, it was heavier than she'd expected, more solid, like something that had been theoretical becoming physical. "Can you prove it in court?" Wyatt asked. "I can testify to my findings," Eleanor said, "with the comparison analysis I've just completed." "Yes, I can prove it." Finch looked at Clara. "This changes the nature of what we're doing. This isn't a procedural defense anymore. This is fraud. Criminal fraud. Which means before we go to Judge Harlan about the land, we may want to consider—" "I want to go to the town," Clara said. Everyone looked at her. "Not just the judge," she said. "I want to go to the town meeting. The one that's scheduled for Saturday. It's the quarterly meeting. The whole county will be there." She looked at Finch. "Pruitt came here expecting me to deal with this quietly. He expected a private settlement or a private defeat. He did not expect to be made visible." She paused. "I want to make him visible." Finch was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant risk," he said. "Public accusation before a legal proceeding." "I'm not going to accuse him," Clara said. "I'm going to present the evidence in front of the people who live here, in front of the people whose land he may also be looking at." She looked at Wyatt. "How many ranches in this county are run by people who might be vulnerable to exactly this kind of scheme?" Wyatt didn't hesitate. 6 or 7 that I know of. People who've had bad seasons. People with older documentation on their properties. Then they need to know what Pruitt does," Clara said. "Not after he's done it to them now." Finch looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor Vass, who had returned to packing her tools with the air of someone whose portion of the work was complete, and who had no opinion about what happened next. "You understand," Finch said, "that if you do this, there is no quiet settlement. There is no version of this where Pruitt backs down and you both walk away." "I'm not looking for a version of that," Clara said. "He will fight you. He's already fighting me. The difference is I'll be fighting him back in public." She kept her voice level. "He counted on me being alone, Mr. Finch. He counted on a widow with no resources and no standing making a decision based on fear. I'd like him to find out what he actually counted on." Another silence. This one felt different from the others, not uncomfortable, but weighted, with the particular gravity of a moment where something has been decided that can't be undecided. "All right," Finch said. "Then we have 48 hours to prepare." Those 48 hours moved fast, and they moved hard. Wyatt sent Pete Dawson to 3 neighboring ranches with a message not about the Saturday meeting specifically, but about Pruitt, about the scheme. about the fact that people who had received letters or inquiries from Billings land interests in the past 3 years should come prepared to talk. 2 of the 3 ranchers sent word back that they were coming and that they had things to say. Clara spent Friday at her desk, writing. Not legal argument, Finch had that, but her own statement. What Thomas had tried to do, what she had found in that locked box. What it meant to build something year by year with your hands, and have someone decide from behind a desk in Billings that it was easier to take than to earn. She wrote it in plain language. She didn't dress it up. She wasn't performing grief or asking for sympathy. She was stating facts in the voice of a woman who had lived them. And when she read it back to herself on Friday evening, she thought it was the most honest thing she had ever written. Wyatt came by at 8. She read it to him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Don't change anything, he said. Nothing? Not a word, he said. It's exactly right. She looked at him across the kitchen. He was serious, not the kind of serious that performed itself, but the kind that came from meaning it completely. What if it's not enough, she said. What if Pruitt has better lawyers? Better arguments. What if the town doesn't care the way I think they will? They'll care, Wyatt said. Because it isn't just about you, and they'll know it. People who've built something with their hands understand what it means to have someone try to take it. He looked at her steadily. And because you're going to stand up there and tell them the truth. And people in this territory have not had enough of that. She looked at him for a moment. You're a harder man to argue with than you appear. I'm easier to argue with than I appear, he said. I just tend to be right. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, and the ease of it, coming out of a week of sustained tension. It surprised Wyatt, too. She could tell, though his surprise was the pleasant kind. The kind that settled something. Saturday morning came cold and certain. The quarterly town meeting was held in the largest space Red Willow had, the main floor of the grain hall. With its long tables and the smell of sawdust and the particular acoustics of a room built for function rather than comfort. By 10 o'clock it was full in a way that told Clara the word had traveled. Ranchers from the outer county, women from the church committees, merchants, 3 people she recognized from neighboring towns who had no ordinary business at a Red Willow meeting. And Gerald Pruitt, seated near the back, with Cowell beside him, and a man she didn't know who had the specific bearing of legal representation. Pruitt had known this was coming. She'd expected that a man like him had sources, and 48 hours was enough time for word to reach a man staying at the town hotel. He had come anyway, which meant one of 2 things. Either he was confident in his position, or he understood that not coming would be worse. She didn't know which yet. She was about to find out. The meeting opened with ordinary business. She sat through it with Wyatt to her left and Finch to her right. And she kept her hands in her lap and her face composed. And she did not look at Pruitt, because she had decided before she arrived that she was not going to give him the satisfaction of being checked on. When the ordinary business concluded, the meeting chairman, a man named Garrett, who ran the county surveyor's office and was known for doing things in proper order, looked at his agenda. We have a matter raised for open discussion, Garrett said. Mrs. Clara Whitmore has requested time to address the county on a matter of public concern. Mrs. Whitmore. She stood up. The room went quieter than it had been for the ordinary business. That quality of quiet that happens when people know they are about to hear something they came specifically to hear. Clara walked to the front, turned to face the room. She had stood in front of these people at church, at community events, at Thomas's funeral, and she had felt the weight of their collective attention before. This was different. This was the weight of people paying attention because they had decided to, because something she had done, or was about to do, had made them willing to look directly at her rather than sideways. She looked at the room, not at Pruitt, at the room. And she began to speak. She told it plainly. Thomas's debt, the locked box, the document she'd found, the amount that didn't match what Cal Dennison remembered. The letter from Harlan Cross, with Thomas's no written in the margin. Eleanor Vass's examination of the document. The specific alterations, the amount. The collateral language. The change from a lien to an outright claim. She told it, without drama and without apology and without the particular performance of grief that she'd always hated watching other women deploy, because they thought it was expected of them. She told it as fact, as a sequence of events that had happened to her family. Documented and provable, with a lawyer in the room who could speak to the legal specifics. Halfway through, she heard someone shift behind her, and she knew without looking that it was Pruitt moving in his chair. She kept going. When she finished the account of her own situation, she looked directly at the ranchers she knew had come from the outer county in response to Wyatt's message. I don't believe my husband was the only person in this county who received this kind of approach, she said. I believe Mr. Pruitt's method is a pattern, not an exception. And I believe that pattern is still operating. She paused. If anyone in this room has received correspondence from Billings Land Interests in the past 3 years, letters about buying your property, offers of loans, claims against your estate, I'd ask you to speak with Mr. Finch before you leave today. The silence that followed was absolute for exactly 2 seconds. Then a man named Rupert Haynes, who ran a cattle operation 12 miles east, stood up. I got a letter, he said, 8 months ago. Offered to buy my south pasture at about half what it's worth. Said I had a debt obligation I didn't know about. He looked around the room. I threw it away because I didn't recognize the name on it. What name? Finch said. Cross, Haynes said. Harlan Cross. The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. Clara heard it go out, the ripple of recognition. The quiet exchanges between neighbors, the particular sound of a room where people are rapidly revising their understanding of something. Then a woman in the third row, a rancher named Judith Alcott, who had lost her husband 2 years before Clara lost Thomas, raised her hand. I got one too, she said. Her voice was very controlled. I assumed it was legitimate. I almost answered it. Pruitt stood up. He stood up in the back of the room, and the room went quiet again. A different quality of quiet this time, the alert, coiled quiet of people waiting to see what a cornered man does. This is slander, he said. His voice was large, carrying the voice of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. Mrs. Whitmore is making serious accusations with no standing. The standing, Finch said, rising from his seat, is documentary evidence examined by a certified document analyst whose findings I will be presenting to Judge Harlan on Monday morning, along with a request for an injunction against any further action on the properties of Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Alcott, or Mr. Haynes, pending the outcome of a fraud investigation. Pruitt looked at Finch. Something in his expression shifted, controlled, still contained. But the edges of it had changed. You have no case, Pruitt said. I have a document analyst, 2 additional witnesses, and a pattern of correspondence, Finch said. You're welcome to make that argument to Judge Harlan. Pruitt's lawyer leaned up and said something in a low voice. Pruitt listened, looked back at the room, looked at Clara. She looked back at him. She had waited the whole meeting for this. For the moment he looked directly at her, and she met his eyes without any of the things he had counted on finding there. No fear, no appeal, no hope of negotiation. Just a woman standing in front of her community with a 1.5 years of work behind her, and the truth in front of her, and absolutely no intention of moving. Something moved through Pruitt's expression. She couldn't name it precisely. It wasn't defeat. Not yet. It wasn't retreat. But it was recognition, the recognition of a man who has done this many times and is looking at the one occasion where the person on the other side of it is not going to behave like the others. He sat down. The room exhaled. Garrett, the meeting chairman, looked at his paper and then at the room, and then with the practical certainty of a man who knew when a meeting had reached its natural conclusion, said, I think we'll take a recess. The room broke into a noise that was not quite speech and not quite uproar, but something between the two. And people were moving. turning to their neighbors. Standing, and Clara felt Wyatt's hand briefly on her elbow steadying. Not drawing attention, just there, and then she was surrounded by people she hadn't expected. Margaret Holloway, of all people, was first. She pushed through to Clara with an expression that Clara had never seen on her face before. Not warmth exactly, and not apology. Margaret Holloway was not a woman who moved easily through apology, but something genuine. Something arrived at. That took courage, Margaret said. I want you to know I heard every word. Clara looked at her for a moment. Thank you, Margaret. I may have been. Margaret paused. I may have been a poor neighbor to you this past year. I'd like to be better at it. It was the most Clara was going to get from that direction, and she knew it. And she accepted it for what it was, not full restitution, but a door opening where one had been closed. I'd appreciate that, she said. Judith Alcott reached her next, and she was less restrained than Margaret. She took both of Clara's hands in hers and held them. You just saved me from making the worst mistake of my life, she said. I was 2 days away from writing back to that crossman. You didn't write, Clara said. That's what matters. Because of you, Alcott said. Because you didn't stay quiet. Rupert Haynes told Finch he had the original letter from Harlan Cross in a box at his ranch and could have it to him by Sunday. 2 other ranchers approached with their own stories. Their own letters, their own moments of almost. Finch stood in the corner of the grain hall with his notepad and received all of it with the composed efficiency of a man watching a case acquire mass in real time. Pruitt left the meeting before it formally reconvened. She watched him go from across the room, him and Cowell and the lawyer, moving toward the door with the particular velocity of people who have decided not to be present for what comes next. She felt Wyatt come to stand beside her. Not close. Just beside. He's not done, she said, because she still believed that. Because men like Pruitt did not become done because of one bad meeting. No, Wyatt agreed. But he's different now. She looked at where Pruitt had been standing. What do you mean? Before today he was hunting you, Wyatt said. After today he's the one being hunted. He paused. That changes how a man fights. She understood what he meant. A man operating in confidence, with the wind at his back and a target he believes won't move, is one kind of opponent. A man who has just been publicly identified, who has witnesses lining up to speak to a lawyer, who has a fraud investigation bearing down on him from a judge in Billings, that was a different kind of opponent entirely. Smaller in some ways, more desperate in others, more dangerous. Possibly. She filed that last part away. Finch found her before she left. Monday morning, he said. Judge Harlan, I'll have the full document analysis, the witness statements, and the pattern evidence. I need you there. I'll be there, she said. It's a 2-day trip to Billings. I know how far Billings is, she said. Finch almost smiled. Yes. I expect you do. He looked at her with the careful assessment he'd been applying since the first time she'd walked into his office. Mrs. Whitmore, what you did in there today, I want you to understand that most people in your position don't do that. Most people in my position don't know what I know, she said. No, but they also don't decide to use it the way you did. He paused. You built a case. You gathered evidence. You understood the legal exposure. You made a public argument in a room full of people, and you did it without hysteria and without apology. He paused again, and she got the impression that the next thing he said was not something he said often. You have a formidable mind, Mrs. Whitmore. Clara looked at Arthur Finch. I had a lot of cold nights at Thomas's desk to work with, she said. Yes, he said, but what you did with those nights, that was yours. She held that for a moment. Then she said, Monday, Billings, I'll be ready. She walked out of the grain hall into the cold air. And Red Willow's Main Street was full of the noise of people still talking, still moving, still processing the thing that had just happened in that room. And she moved through it without stopping, nodding to the people who nodded at her, accepting the words that were offered without taking too much time with any of them. because she was tired in a way that went to the bone, and she still had work to do. Wyatt fell into step beside her. He had a way of doing that, appearing at her side without announcement. As though he'd simply been there all along, and she'd only just noticed. They walked half the length of Main Street without speaking. The Holloway woman apologized, he said. Close enough to one, Clara said. That's more than I expected. More than I expected too, she paused. People surprise you when you give them a reason to be different than they've been. He was quiet for a moment. You gave them a reason today, he said. I gave them information, she said. What they do with it is up to them. He looked at her sidelong. You know that's not entirely true. She thought about Judith Alcott's hands around hers. About Rupert Haynes saying, I got a letter. About the room full of people who had come in expecting one kind of meeting and left understanding something they hadn't understood when they arrived. Maybe not entirely, she said. They reached the corner where their paths divided, her road going east, his going north, and stopped. The town noise was behind them now, and the cold had settled, and it was the kind of late afternoon that offered the particular clarity of a day that had contained more than a day usually holds. Wyatt turned to her. He had his hat in his hands again, that habit she'd noticed from the very first morning outside Fitch's store. The turning of it, by the brim, the sign of something being thought through. Come have supper at the Double M, he said. You shouldn't be alone tonight. She looked at him. Thought about the comment Margaret Holloway might make. Thought about the whole county and its opinions, and the price she'd paid for not Ed Centerford. Thought about what he'd said on the porch of her house weeks ago. Beside, not behind, not in front of, all right, she said. Something settled in his expression. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the particular ease of a man whose offer has been accepted by someone who doesn't accept things easily. And what that means. Pete'll have something on, he said. Pete cooks badly, Wyatt said, but generously, she laughed. And this time the laugh came easily, without the startled quality of the last one, without the surprise of finding something light in the middle of something heavy. It just came, and that, she would think later, was when she knew. Not that anything had been declared or decided. Not that the words had been said. Because they hadn't, and she wasn't ready for them yet, and neither, she suspected, was he. But something had moved. Something that had been very careful, very guarded, very much on the right side of its own line, had shifted an inch. Maybe it was enough. For now. For today, at the end of this particular day, it was more than enough. The road to the Double M went north. She walked beside him. And behind them, in a hotel room on the edge of Red Willow, Gerald Pruitt was on his second glass of whiskey and his third conversation with his lawyer. And the conversation was going worse each time. The road to Billings took 2 days each direction. And Clara spent the first morning of the journey watching the country move past and thinking about Thomas. Not the grief version of Thomas, not the loss of him, but the real version, the man who had sat at that desk in the small room and written "no" in the margin of a letter and then said nothing to her about it. She had been angry at him for that, in the days after she'd found the letter. A quiet and private anger that she hadn't shown to anyone, because grief and anger at a dead man felt like a betrayal of something. But sitting in the wagon on the road to Billings, with Wyatt driving and Finch reading beside at her and the cold coming in off the hills, she let herself feel the full shape of it for the first time. Thomas had tried to protect her. He'd done it the wrong way. The way proud men did things the wrong way, by holding the weight himself until it became too heavy to hold, and then dying before he could put it down. She loved him. She was angry at him. Both of those things were true, and neither one canceled the other. And understanding that, fully, clearly, without the softening she'd been applying to her own grief for 14 months, felt like setting something down that she'd been carrying without realizing it. Wyatt didn't push conversation on the road. He drove and she thought, and Finch read his papers, and, when they stopped for the midday meal at a station house, She ate, without tasting much, and Wyatt refilled her coffee without commenting on the fact that she'd been quiet for 3 hours. She appreciated that about him in a way that was getting harder to keep at arm's length. They arrived in Billings late on Sunday. Finch went directly to his office. Wyatt saw her to the rooming house where she'd stayed on the previous visit, said he'd be at Finch's office by 8 in the morning, and left without ceremony. She lay in the narrow bed of the rooming house and stared at the ceiling and went through it again. In her mind, the document, Eleanor Vass's findings, Rupert Haynes's letter, Judith Alcott's near miss, the pattern that Finch had laid out in careful chronological order, and decided that she had done everything she could do to prepare. That the next 12 hours were not hers to manage. She slept better than she had in 2 weeks. Judge Harlan's courtroom was not large, and it was not formal in the way of courtrooms she had imagined from novels. It had the practical plainness of a territory that was still deciding what it was going to be. Wooden walls and wooden floors, and a bench that was just a bench with a man behind it who had the tired eyes of someone who had been asked to decide too many things for too long. But his mind, she would discover in the next several hours, was not tired at all. Pruitt was there with his lawyer, a man named Cadwell, who dressed expensively and spoke precisely and had the particular confidence of someone who won more arguments than he lost. Cowell was there too, sitting in the back, with the careful stillness of a man who had been told to be invisible. Finch presented first. He was methodical in the way that she had come to understand was his specific genius, not dramatic, not trying to overwhelm, just building, piece by piece, the architecture of what had happened. Eleanor Vass's document analysis. The comparison between the figure Thomas had sought from Cal Dennison and the figure on Pruitt's document. The Harlan Cross letter with Thomas's no in the margin. The correspondence pattern: 3 counties, 6 ranches, all approached within the same 18-month window, all through the same combination of Pruitt's loans and Cross's purchase offers, all targeted at properties owned by people who had recently lost a spouse or faced a significant financial setback. 6 ranches. Clara had not known until Finch said it in that courtroom that the number was 6. She heard Wyatt exhale slowly beside her. Judge Harlan's eyes, which had appeared tired, were now the eyes of someone who was not tired at all, but had learned to look that way, so that people said things in front of him they would otherwise have held back. Cadwell's response was aggressive and technically sophisticated and built on 3 arguments: the legitimacy of the original debt, the questionable provenance of Eleanor Vass's methodology, and the claim that the procedural failures around the estate notification were the result of administrative error rather than deliberate avoidance. He was good. Clara sat and listened to him and acknowledged to herself that he was good, that he was making real arguments and not just noise. And she felt the first genuine edge of fear she'd let herself feel since the whole thing had started. Not panic, but the clean, focused fear of someone who understands that the thing they're fighting is not guaranteed to go their way. Then Judge Harlan looked at Cadwell and said, "Counselor, of the 6 properties identified in the pattern, Mr. Finch has presented, how many received formal notification of debt claims against their estates within the statutory period?" Cadwell paused. "My client's position is that the notification requirements. I didn't ask about your client's position," Harlan said. "I asked how many received notification within the statutory period. It's a number between 0 and 6. Another pause. "1, Cadwell said. 1, Harlan repeated. He looked at the papers in front of him. "And the one that received notification, that would be the Jenkins property in Carter County, which was sold at settlement 8 months ago." "That settlement was voluntary?" Harlan said. "Your word or theirs?" Clara looked at Finch. Finch was not looking back at her. He was watching the judge with the stillness of a man, watching something happen that he had hoped would happen and is not willing to disrupt by reacting to it. The next hour was the most precise and exhausting thing Clara had ever witnessed. It was not dramatic the way she'd half expected legal proceedings to be dramatic. No raised voices. No sudden revelations, no single moment where everything turned. It was a careful, methodical dismantling. Harlan asked questions. Cadwell answered them. Harlan asked follow-up questions. The answers got shorter. The confidence in them got thinner. At one point, Cadwell asked for a recess to consult with his client. Harlan gave him 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, Clara sat in the courtroom with Wyatt to her left and Finch to her right. And nobody said anything for a very long time. Then Wyatt said, quietly, "How are you doing?" She thought about it honestly. "Terrified," she said. "And sure." Both at the same time. "That's usually the right combination," he said. She looked at him. "Is that from experience?" "Building a ranch from $40, he said. "You spend a lot of time terrified and sure." She held that for a moment. "Does it get easier, the terrified part?" "It gets smaller," he said. "The sure part gets bigger. After a while the ratio changes." She looked at the front of the courtroom. "I need the ratio to change today. It will," he said. Simply. Without performance. She believed him. When Cadwell returned from his 20-minute recess, he returned alone. He stood in front of Judge Harlan and in the flat, drained tone of a man who has just had a very difficult conversation with his client, said that Mr. Pruitt was prepared to discuss a resolution. The word resolution moved through the room differently than any other word had. Finch stood up immediately. "The resolution my client requires," he said, "is the return of all documentation related to the Whitmore debt, a formal withdrawal of any claims against the Whitmore property, and a written accounting of all other properties against which similar claims have been asserted." Cadwell said, "My client would need to additionally," Finch said, "the Montana Territory District Attorney's Office has been notified of this proceeding. Whatever private resolution the parties arrive at has no bearing on the criminal inquiry into the document alterations." That one landed differently. Cadwell went still. Behind her, Clara heard Cowell stand up and move to the door. Harlan watched all of it with the tired eyes that weren't tired. "Gentlemen," Harlan said, "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess. When I return, I'm going to ask Mr. Cadwell whether his client has a response to the full scope of Mr. Finch's terms. I'd suggest using the time productively." He got up and left the bench. Clara turned to Finch. "The district attorney," she said quietly. "Did you?" "I sent a letter Friday morning," Finch said. "When Haynes and Alcott came forward, the case became a criminal matter as well as a civil one. The DA's office was the correct next step. You didn't tell me." "I was concerned you might find it overwhelming," Finch said. She looked at him. "Mr. Finch, please don't manage my information." He had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "You're right. I apologize. Does the DA actually know about this, or was that a move?" "Both," Finch said. "I sent the letter. Whether they've read it yet," he paused. "The letter exists. The rest is Cadwell's problem to verify." Clara absorbed that. Then she said, "You're better at this than you look." Finch almost smiled. "I've been told that before." The 30-minute recess became 45. Clara waited. Wyatt got her water she didn't drink. Finch went over his papers for the 4th time. Outside the courtroom windows, Billings made its ordinary noises, entirely unaware that in this particular room a question was being decided that meant everything to at least one person present and would be forgotten by everyone else within the year. When Cadwell came back, he came back without Pruitt. He stood in front of Harlan's bench, and he delivered what he delivered in the voice of a man who has argued a position until he can't argue it anymore, and has decided that the most dignified available option is a clean exit. Pruitt would withdraw all claims against the Whitmore property. He would return the original documentation to Clara's estate. He would provide a written accounting of all properties against which similar claims had been made. He would make no contact with any of the identified property owners, and he would cooperate with any inquiry from the district attorney's office that arose from the document examination findings. The last part was not voluntary, as everyone in the room understood, but it was being offered as voluntary which allowed Cadwell to call it a negotiated resolution rather than a surrender, and Clara understood enough about how these things worked to let that distinction stand. Harlan looked at Finch. "Mrs. Whitmore's counsel," he said. "Are these terms acceptable?" Finch looked at Clara. She looked back at him. Thought about the locked box. About $41 of unpaid credit at Fitch's general store. About Thomas's no in the margin of a letter that he'd put in a filing drawer and never told her about. About 14 months of cold mornings and relentless work and the particular determination of a woman who has nothing left to lose except the one thing she refuses to lose. "They're acceptable," she said. Harlan nodded once. "Then we'll have the terms formalized before close of business today." He looked at both lawyers in the way of a man who has made a decision and considers the matter concluded. "I'd also note, for the record, that the document examination findings have been entered into evidence and will be available to the district attorney's office. That portion of the matter is outside the resolution between these parties." He looked at Cadwell specifically. "Make sure your client understands that." Cadwell said that his client understood. Harlan got up from the bench. It was over, not dramatically. Not with a moment that felt like a movie version of justice. With trumpets and light. It ended the way most real things ended, with paperwork. And tired people. And the quiet deflation of sustained tension. And the particular feeling of a problem resolving that is less like triumph and more like finally being able to put something down that you'd been carrying too long to remember the weight of. Clara sat in the courtroom for a moment after everyone else had begun to move. Finch was already at the clerk's table. Cadwell had left. Wyatt was standing by the door, giving her the space to have whatever she needed to have in this moment. She breathed. She thought, "Thomas, I kept it. The Northfield is ours, and I kept it." She didn't cry. She had promised herself at Fitch's store that she would not cry in public. And she had learned by now that promises you make to yourself on your worst days are the ones worth keeping. She stood up, picked up her coat, walked to where Wyatt was standing. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there told him what he needed to know. Because he didn't ask how she was, and he didn't say anything at all. He simply opened the door, and they walked out into the cold Billings air together. And that was enough. The ride back to Red Willow felt different from the ride out. Finch had the finalized terms in his satchel and reviewed them periodically with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built a thing well and is checking his work. Clara sat beside Wyatt on the wagon bench. She'd moved from the back on the second day of travel without making a point of it, and they talked on and off about things that weren't the case, which was its own form of relief. His first winter at the Double M. The horse that had almost not made it. A summer when the north pasture had flooded and he'd spent 3 weeks sleeping in the barn to manage it. Small things. The real texture of a life. She told him about the spring she and Tuss had planted the north field for the first time. How the seed had been expensive and she'd been terrified they'd done it wrong. How they'd both stood at the kitchen window in the early morning for 2 weeks waiting for the first green. How the morning it came, she'd cried over breakfast and Thomas had pretended not to notice because he understood she didn't want comfort. She wanted to feel it. "He sounds like he understood you," Wyatt said. "Better than anyone," she said. "Except in the ways he didn't." "That's most people," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." They were quiet for a while. The wagon moved, and the country moved around it, and the cold settled in as the afternoon went on. "What will you do first?" he asked. "When you're back." She thought about it. "Go to the north field," she said.
Walk it.
"Just walk it and know it's mine without any question over it."
And after that?
"After that, I have planting to think about. The spring schedule. Some repairs I've been putting off." She paused. "And I owe Cal Dennison a conversation. He helped us without knowing he was helping us, and I want him to know what it led to. Haynes and Alcott will want to talk to you," Wyatt said. "You did as much for them as you did for yourself today." "I did what needed to be done," she said. "Haynes and Alcott did their own part." He looked at her sidelong. "You're very determined not to take credit." I'm determined to take accurate credit, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Finch thinks you have a formidable mind. She raised an eyebrow. He told you that? He told me that the second time we met in his office, Wyatt said. He said he'd never had a client who arrived at the first meeting having already done more of the legal groundwork than most trained lawyers would have thought to do. She looked at the road ahead, felt something warm and complicated move through her chest. I had to, she said. There wasn't anyone else. There was, Wyatt said quietly. Eventually, she looked at him. He was watching the road, not her, giving her the privacy of being looked away from, while she received what he was saying. Yes, she said. Eventually there was. They didn't say anything else about it. But something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. And they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat between them, on the wagon bench for the rest of the ride home, with the particular warmth of a thing that has been true for a while, and has finally allowed to be spoken. Red Willow received her back on a Thursday. It received her differently than she'd left it. Not with ceremony. Red Willow was not a ceremonial place, but with the small, significant signals of a town that had revised its position. Harold Fitch, of all people, stopped her outside store. He had the expression of a man doing something his pride was not entirely comfortable with, which she appreciated more than if he'd seemed easy about it. I heard what happened in Billings, he said. News travels, she said. I wanted to say he stopped, cleared his throat, started again. What I said to you in my store, in front of people. That was, I could have handled that differently. She looked at him. You could have, she said. But you didn't, and here we are. He nodded. He seemed to be waiting for her to give him something more absolution. Perhaps, or the particular grace of a woman telling a man that his behavior was understandable in the circumstances. She didn't give him either, because neither was accurate. My account, she said. I'll have it settled by spring. I'd like to continue doing business with your store. He blinked. He hadn't expected that. Of course, he said, yes. Of course. Good, she said, and kept walking. Margaret Holloway came to the house that Saturday, with a jar of preserves and the careful bearing of a woman who is doing something difficult and knows it. Clara let her in, made coffee, listened to the apology, which was more complete than the one at the Grain Hall. Margaret Holloway, it turned out, was capable of more than Clara had given her credit for, when she was in private and not performing for an audience. I was frightened of your situation, Margaret said. Finally, I think that's the honest answer. You'd lost everything and kept going, and I didn't know what to do with that. It made me look at things I didn't want to look at. Clara looked at her across the kitchen table. At this woman who had made the last 2 months harder and was now sitting in her kitchen, trying, imperfectly but genuinely, to account for it. That's honest, Clara said. I appreciate it. Is it enough? Margaret asked. And the question was raw enough that Clara understood she was actually asking, not performing humility, but genuinely uncertain. It's a start, Clara said. And meant it. The planting started earlier than expected that year. Judith Alcott came to help for 3 days in late February, and Rupert Haynes sent 2 of his men for a week in March, because he said a woman who had saved his south pasture from a fraudster deserved someone to dig her fence post holes. And he wasn't wrong. Between the help and the better supplies, and the fact that she was no longer carrying the weight of Pruitt's shadow over everything she did, Clara got the north field in early, got the south pasture seeded by mid-April, got the barn repaired completely for the first time in 2 years. Wyatt was there through most of it. Not every day the Double M had its own demands, its own schedule, its own exhausting spring rhythms, but most of it. He worked beside her the way he always had, without announcement, without performance, with the uncomplicated practicality of a man who showed up because the work was there, and he had decided to be the kind of person who showed up. The difference now was that she didn't argue with him about it. She didn't account for herself or calculate what she owed, or keep her defenses at the ready in case the kindness turned out to have terms. She had run out of that particular energy, somewhere between Billings and home. Somewhere on that wagon seat, with the winter cold coming in. And she had not particularly bothered to resupply it. She let him come, she let him work beside her. She made him coffee, and he fixed her fence posts, and they talked about practical things, and sometimes about deeper things, and occasionally about nothing at all. And it was the easiest she had been in longer than she could account for. In May, on an evening, when they'd spent most of the day working the north field, the one she'd walked alone the morning she got back from Billings, the one that was hers without question, now they sat on her porch steps as the day went down, and Wyatt had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way he did when he was working towards something. She waited. She'd learned he got there on his own schedule, and pressing him only pushed the thing further out. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been turning your hat for about 10 minutes. He looked at the hat. Set it beside him on the step. "I'm not good at this," he said. "You're better than you think," she said. He looked at her. "How would you know? Because you've been doing it for 6 months without saying the words. And I've understood you perfectly well," she said. Something in his face shifted the stillness of it, broke for a moment. And what was underneath it was something she had suspected but hadn't let herself be sure of. Something warm and real, and slightly terrified, which felt right to her because she was the same. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, "whatever you're about to say." "The answer is yes." He looked at her. "You don't know what I'm going to say," he said. "No," she said. "But I know you." And yes, he looked at her for a long moment, with that complete, undivided attention of his, the kind that had unsettled her at the start, because she wasn't used to being seen that clearly and had learned over 6 months to receive it as the specific gift it was. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "If you're willing. I'm not asking for anything more than that right now. Just to be here. Officially. Whatever that means." She looked at him. Thought about the first morning she'd seen him, leaning against the warehouse wall, with his hat in his hands, and no pressure in him whatsoever. Thought about wire in a saddlebag and lumber for a porch step, and a jar of liniment left without comment. Thought about a wagon seat on the road to Billings, and the word eventually, and what it had meant when he said it. "Wyatt," she said, "you've been courting me since October." "We're just naming it." He was quiet for a moment. Then the almost smile arrived, not almost this time. Fully, reaching his eyes and changing his whole face in the way she had catalogued without meaning to over the last 6 months. "I suppose we are," he said. She looked at the north field. At the green that was coming up in the early rows of the planting, not far enough yet to be certain, but far enough to believe in. The same feeling as that first spring with Thomas. Standing at the kitchen window, waiting for something fragile and important to decide to grow. "He would have liked you," she said. "Thomas? He would have argued with you about land management and then respected you for arguing back." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "That's a fine thing to say. It's true," she said. "And he would have been relieved." She paused. "He worried about me being alone. I think he knew, at the end, how much he'd left unsaid. And he worried about what that would mean." She looked at the field. "I want him to know it's all right. I want him to know I figured it out. I think he knows," Wyatt said. Simply, without qualification. She let that sit. Around them, Red Willow went on being Red Willow, imperfect and small, and occasionally unkind, and occasionally surprising. A town where people watched, and whispered, and sometimes, when pushed far enough, showed up. The north field held its green rose. The north fence line held its wire. The porch step held its nails. The kitchen held its warmth, and the woman who had walked out of Fitch's general store with 22 cents, and her pride intact, sat on the steps of her house that she had fought for and kept, beside the man who had been beside her since before she knew she needed someone beside her, and felt the shape of her life not as loss, not as survival, but as something being built, still being built, not finished, because the best things never were. She had walked into that general store as a woman the town had written off and walked out the other side of a fight that would have broken most people. And she had not broken, and she had not bent, and she had not become smaller to make anyone else more comfortable. She had become exactly herself, fully, without apology. And sometimes when the world asks everything of you, and you give it, and you are still standing when it's done, that is the only victory that finally, permanently matters. Clara Whitmore was still standing, and she was done surviving alone.